ruined homes, wounded children, and street executions to the sound of cheerful music. This was the scene that greeted American journalist Sidney Schanberg in the capital of Cambodia in the year 1973. Together with a local reporter, they attempt to capture these atrocities on film, for which they are immediately arrested. 2 years later, when the communists take over the city, all foreigners are evacuated. But Schanberg stays behind to help his Cambodian colleague escape. Futilely. The communists capture the Cambodian reporter once more, this time sending him to the countryside. He works tirelessly and subsists on lizards for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is the plot of the 1984 film The Killing Fields. Based on real events, the film won 3 Oscars and 8 awards from the British Academy. Meanwhile, as film critics relished the gripping storyline, those very bloodthirsty communists were still wielding power in Cambodia, led by dictator Pol Pot. They were known as the Khmer Rouge. Some would write comments saying this was shameless lies and capitalist propaganda. What if I told you that the film The Killing Fields doesn't even show half of what the Khmer Rouge truly did in Cambodia, and that the Americans weren't exactly their enemies? The genocide orchestrated by Pol Pot took the lives of 1/4 of Cambodia's population, about 1.5 to 2 million people. According to various data, the average life expectancy in the country plummeted to 18 or even 12 years. This is roughly all that people with no keen interest in the history of Southeast Asia know about Pol Pot. But, as is often the case, any monochrome view of his personality distorts the picture. Don't think for a moment that today I'm going to deny or, even worse, justify this insane genocide. Look, there is a classic narrative. Cambodian dictator nicknamed Pol Pot is the epitome of cartoonish evil. However, we will dig deeper and reveal one of the 20th century's most notorious dictators, presenting a more complex and therefore more frightening persona. Today, you'll learn why communist Pol Pot sought to destroy the proletariat. How did it happen that he formed an alliance with the monarch? Why did the United States support him while he was hated in the Soviet Union? And why, for heaven's sake, did this man ban people from wearing glasses? For this segment, we have studied monographs, historical essays, memoirs, eyewitness testimonies, interviews with the dictator's relatives and associates. The UN's legal materials also play a part, particularly in the second half of this piece when we analyse the anatomy of the Cambodian genocide. The events that led to this bloodbath will shock you as much as the genocide itself. That I guarantee. I imagine if I were to ask you to name the capital of Cambodia, or at least point out where this country is on a globe, the task might not be straightforward for everyone. Let me assist you. We are in Southeast Asia. To the north, there is China. To the south, Malaysia. To the west, across the bay, lies India. But our focus is this part of Asia, Vietnam. Here, the jungles of Laos. And now, between Thailand and Vietnam, Cambodia is falling apart. Specifically, it is the southern Vietnam, which in the 1960s and 1970s was fighting against the communists. This detail is important for us. Okay, we've roughly figured out the map. Now let's transport ourselves to the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, to July 1973, and let's look at it through the eyes of an ordinary city resident. The first thing you'll notice is how oppressively hot it is. Morning in Phnom Penh, as always, began with rain. The dry season ended a couple of months ago. Now it rains 24/7. It's 33 degrees Celsius outside. The humidity is incredible, but the locals have long gotten used to it. Let's assume you're a simple person. Not wealthy, but not exactly poor either. However, you are educated. Early in the morning, you set out for classes at the medical institute. You're already in your 3rd year. And you think that soon you'll become a doctor, as you dreamed. On your way to the university, you ponder how great it is to have the opportunity to receive a full education. None of your family members had such an opportunity. At home, 5 younger sisters are waiting for you. In total, there are 24 people in your family, including all the grandmothers, grandfathers, uncles, aunts and cousins. That's actually not that common, even for the urban population in Cambodia, which has a lower birth rate than the rural areas. Oh, nearly forgot. Cambodia freed itself from the colonial yoke of the French only 20 years ago in 1953, just a couple of years after you were born. And by 1973, the country was already quite urbanized. Out of almost 8 million people, a quarter lived in cities. Most of the people around you are locals, maybe even native. But you still remember how, as a teenager, you saw crowds of refugees on the outskirts of Phnom Penh. They were fleeing from US bombings and raids by South Vietnamese forces. Newspapers at the time reported that American bombs killed up to 150,000 of your fellow citizens. In the past couple of years, the number of refugees around has started to increase again. Your father recently talked to one of them, and he spoke about some Khmer Rouge. These fellows allegedly seize village after village, establish equality everywhere, and move quickly toward Phnom Penh. Rumors don't worry you. People say all sorts of things. Let those villagers entertain themselves as they can. For you, it's another world. Your mind is filled with pharmacology, pathological physiology, and other medical studies. But today, everything will change. Suddenly, you hear the roar of jet engines from beyond the horizon. In the sky, you see several planes heading north, and the aircraft do not appear to be civilian. Could they be bombers? Already in class at the Institute, you hear several dull thuds that make the windows in the auditorium shake. You've never heard such loud noises. A few days later, a fellow student explains to you. Those were the Khmer Rouge trying to break into the city, but they were stopped a couple of kilometers from the capital. This attempt will not be the last. In the next 1.5 years, you'll learn what a curfew is and the daily ration of rice. The population of Phnom Penh will swell from 600,000 first to 2 million and then to 3 million. All because of the refugees fleeing from the combat zones. On the outskirts of the city, slums will emerge, periodically leveled to the ground by the mortars and howitzers of the Khmer Rouge. Everyone with any connections or money will leave the city, but that's only 500,000 people. The rest will remain. And you, along with your family, have nowhere to flee. On the 14th of April 1975, the guns will fall silent. The residents of the Cambodian capital will be allowed to peacefully celebrate the new year according to the local calendar. The people will celebrate and rejoice for a couple of days, and then another massive shelling will descend, followed by a resounding silence. Finally, on the 17th of April, you will see them for the first time, the real Khmer Rouge. Many resemble teenagers, and indeed they are. Some are merely 14 years old. But all are armed to the teeth and regard the city dwellers with disdain. Over the radio, it is announced that your city has been successfully liberated. At last this nightmare is over, you think. One can return to a peaceful life. Of course you can, says a teenage soldier, whom you suddenly find in your home. But only in 3 days. The boy explains to you that the Americans want to bomb the capital to destroy the Khmer Rouge. Therefore, all residents need to evacuate. What can you do? You and your entire family follow the army. You take almost nothing with you. You were promised that you would return home in 3 days. On the outskirts of the city, a column forms, consisting of millions of people. Almost everyone goes voluntarily. Some are led by force. In the crowd, you see seriously ill people. They too are being forced to march. Overall, everything is peaceful, but it's unclear where they are leading you. You do not yet realize that you will not see the capital of your country for many years, and that out of 24 people in your family, only you will survive. Soon, a new season will begin in Cambodia, the third in addition to the dry and rainy seasons. The Season of Hunger. That is the title of an autobiography. Sang Seng, a family doctor from Cambodia who managed to survive Pol Pot's genocide. I have been narrating this entire story from his perspective. 5 years after the evacuation of Phnom Penh, the punk band Dead Kennedys released the song Holiday in Cambodia. There, the musicians mockingly suggest that young, successful American yuppies from the middle and upper classes take a trip to Pol Pot's Cambodia to get a taste of what real life is like. The whole region, including Laos, Myanmar and Malaysia, is referred to as Indochina. And it seems that for as long as one can remember, everything has been far from well there. Cambodia, which lost its greatness around the time Columbus reached America, suffered greatly. In the 15th century, the locals began to be captured into slavery by the Thais, Vietnamese, and Khmers. This is the name of the ethnic group that later became the titular nationality in Cambodia. Later, neighbors began to terrorize the Khmers themselves. Father recounted to little Pol Pot the terrifying times when Vietnamese soldiers gouged out the eyes of Cambodian residents, poured salt on wounds, and buried people alive. Thais retaliated against their opponents, killing children in front of their mothers, and valued human life about as much as we value the life of a mosquito in July. In the middle of the 19th century, both Vietnam and Thailand violated Cambodia. The agenda was the capture and enslavement of the country. A British envoy wrote to his homeland, "The king of this ancient kingdom is ready to fall under the protection of any European nation." The Cambodian authorities faced a choice: to sacrifice independence for peace or to hand over the entire population to the mercy of their neighbors. They settled on the former option. The King of Cambodia threw himself under the protection of France. By the end of the 19th century, the country became a colony and joined French Indochina. Conflicts generally subsided, but the memory of them lingered. These were the conditions under which the future founder of Red Kampuchea had to grow. Pol Pot was born in a fishing village called Prek Spav, right in the heart of Cambodia. In fact, if you went to the National Archives of Cambodia and requested the birth record of Pol Pot, you would find nothing. Because Pol Pot did not exist until the 1970s, when he was nearly 50 years old. Pol Pot is a pseudonym. The future dictator's name was Saloth Sar. Saloth was a surname his father adopted, and Sar is a given name meaning white or pale. In the region, pale skin was, and still is, considered a sign of the elite. Nonetheless, Pol Pot's social standing would have been high with any skin color. We will recall his real name later, but for simplicity, we will use his widely known pseudonym. Among Pol Pot's ancestors, in addition to the Khmers, were Chinese. Though it was not customary to speak of this in the family, it was a sign of, if not nobility, then a very dignified origin. Hence the pale skin, which was also called Chinese. Furthermore, Pol Pot's grandfather fought for the French and even participated in suppressing anti-colonial uprisings. For this, he was granted a place in the administrative system. Simply put, he was a privileged man. Thanks to this, the head of the family owned one of the largest houses in the village, 9 hectares of rice fields, almost 13 football fields, by the way, and several head of cattle. And there was more. Pol Pot's sister was de facto a concubine of the future king of Cambodia. She bore him a son, for which she received the honorable position of the chief woman in the palace. Then another sister of his became a consort to the king. Pol Pot himself lived at the palace for nearly 10 years. He studied in an elite school, funded by relatives close to the royal court. And when he grew up, he availed himself of the services of royal concubines. I narrate this so you understand, quote, from what poor peasant family he supposedly hailed. Well, you surely have heard about these peasants. They would forego bread to spend a night with the Cambodian king's concubines. In the first 25 years of Pol Pot's life, nothing foretold disaster. He was a completely ordinary child. Both teachers and classmates described him as calm, non-confrontational, and he did not stand out in any special way. His academic performance was average. Like all the other children, he played football and basketball, and even learned to play the violin. You would not find any roots of particular cruelty in his family history either. His father was a reserved man. Pol Pot's younger brother later recalled that all the boys in the family grew up similar to their father and maintained excellent relationships with him. To understand the family dynamic, if his children made a mistake, he wouldn't even punish them by making them sit on an anthill, a common practice at the time. He was something of a sweetheart. Pol Pot attended school with the children of French colonists. These were the elite of society, just like him. There he learned French, after which he entered a colonial lycée and then proceeded to college. At the age of 24, then an unknown student, he decided to go to study in France. This choice was not entirely conscious, more of a coincidence. But it was this trivial detail that set in motion the feelings of genocide in which millions would perish. On the 1st of October in the year 1949, Pol Pot found himself in Paris. He spoke French but felt like a stranger. He exclusively socialized with other Cambodians there. Initially, for about a year, he studied diligently, but then began reading philosophical literature and joining various political circles. The first such circle was informal. Pol Pot and his friends discussed the independence of Cambodia. At that time, as a reminder, it was still under French control. Why did he have such thoughts? After World War II, the region barely had a chance to breathe before sinking into a new war, the First Indochina War. Local peoples began to reclaim their independence from France, which was trying to recover from yet another military conflict. The main battleground was Vietnam. To simplify, I will list 4 main points that we simply cannot ignore. Firstly, the resistance against the French had moral justification. For example, a dispute arose with the Vietnamese government regarding import duties. As an argument, the French shelled an entire city with ship cannons, resulting in the deaths of 6,000 Vietnamese. This, even though France formally recognized Vietnam's independence. Now do you understand how the Cambodians felt about remaining under the control of such figures? Secondly, within both Vietnam and Cambodia, partisans of varying degrees of radicalism were already operating. Both leftist and rightist partisans were nationalists. Japan, which occupied Indochina under the slogan "Asia for Asians," aided this situation. Since then, the region has been steeped in chauvinism, and it has become ingrained in the psyche of the people that the French must be kicked out. Furthermore, communism in post-war Asia was a very trendy narrative. With a highly relevant ideological framework, the communist USSR had crushed Nazism, demonstrating that the system worked. In the year 1949, Mao won the Chinese Civil War. A year before that, independent North Korea appeared on the map. The issue here is not so much that Asians collectively believed in the unification of the world's proletariat. Rather, it's that, through the external attributes of communism, it was possible to unite a disparate, impoverished, and embittered populace and lead them into war against their oppressors. A perfect model for Asian nationalists. However, what's surprising here is that nationalism didn't just coexist with communism. In the anti-colonial movement, they worked hand in hand. Finally, the most important factor. Remember I mentioned that Cambodia borders South Vietnam? Well, during the United States invasion of Vietnam, Cambodia became a staging ground for Vietnamese communists. From Cambodia, it was convenient to transport weapons and plan attacks, and to recruit among the locals, of course. As a result, the people of Cambodia became steeped in ideas of national superiority, communism, and the anti-colonial movement. A volatile mix. Cambodia's elite, with whom Pol Pot communicated in Paris, thought along the same lines. During their Parisian debates, the students realized that without communism, Cambodia would never see independence. Consequently, they founded a Marxist group, aptly named Cercle Marxiste. This was a more solid structure with leaders, cells, and its own newspaper. At first, Pol Pot did not hold any important positions. He simply read and discussed theory with his comrades. Later, he joined the French Communist Party with them, which had just recently been reinstated after being banned in 1939. At that time, it was the largest party in France. All of this helped forge connections among Cambodian communists with each other, and for Pol Pot, with influential party functionaries. Pol Pot's comrades recalled that he spoke very little about himself, and in his speeches not only amazed everyone with his theoretical knowledge but also skillfully roused the audience. Both new party members and seasoned communists were impressed by him. It was at this stage that Pol Pot decided he would become no less the leader of the Cambodian National Liberation Movement. One of the debate participants remembered his words, "I will manage the revolutionary organization, I will be its general secretary, I will maintain the files, I will control the ministers, I will ensure that they do not deviate from the line that corresponds to the people's interests." Quite ambitious for a 25-year-old student. At the same time, he started writing political pamphlets against the Cambodian government, such as Monarchy or Democracy, under the pseudonym Khmer Rouge, meaning True Khmer. Eventually, the communist group decided to move from words to action. First, They needed to understand which of these countless armed groups to support in the Indochina War, which was expected to escalate into a civil war. Clearly the left-wing nationalists, but which ones in particular? There were many. For this, they needed a scout who would be sent into the thick of things. Pol Pot volunteered to fly back to Cambodia to assess the situation on the ground, especially since he had completely flunked the session. This was no time for passing exams. To build a political career, one must liberate the nation. At the very end of 1952, when Pol Pot left France and returned to Cambodia, he did not recognize his native country. The main secondary character in our story has faced more failures than any politician could dream of in their wildest nightmare. Meet King Sihanouk. He was crowned in the year 1941 because the French administration liked him after the death of the previous king, his grandfather, the one with whom Pol Pot's sisters lived. The colonial authorities chose the 18-year-old Sihanouk because they thought he would be more controllable than his father, the direct heir to the throne. Spoiler alert, they were wrong. But where? The king started off well. After the war, he established press freedom in Cambodia, allowed political parties, and granted voting rights to all citizens, but only males. Then he signed the very constitution that gave the country limited autonomy. And then something went wrong. Progressive Cambodians, including Pol Pot and his comrades, supported the Democratic Party, and they were real opposition figures. To understand who these people were, they demanded full independence from France and called the local guerrillas fighting against the French patriots. Other parties either happily crunched the French baguette or were from the right-wing nationalists, that is, anti-communists. In the first elections, the Democrats won an absolute majority in Parliament. The king looked at all this and decided that the Parliament needed to be dissolved. Re-elections were held 2 years later. Votes were counted relatively honestly, so the Democrat nationalists again confidently won and began to act boldly once more. For example, they started supporting demonstrations against the authorities. This drove the king to a frenzy. He once again dissolved the deputies and sent key party leaders to prison. For the communists, this was a sign. The government, and especially the king, could not be trusted. That is why Pol Pot was sent to get acquainted with the insurgents. This was Plan B, in case negotiations with the authorities failed. Meanwhile, the insurgents were actively fighting the French, so Pol Pot had to go to the front. In Cambodia, the fighting was not as intense as in Vietnam. No more than a few hundred people died per year. But the assignment could not be called a vacation. The situation there was intense. French soldiers simply did not regard the partisans as human. The insurgents, in turn, lost their humanity in an instant. If after a battle a French soldier was unfortunate enough to remain alive and fall into the hands of the combatants, he would be made to kneel before his future grave. Then the insurgents started dancing around him with a sword, periodically inflicting cuts until he bled out. A soldier could have his stomach slit open, his liver removed, roasted and eaten to acquire the enemy's strength. But that was only if particularly superstitious people were involved. These people would later form the backbone of the Khmer Rouge, only in dozens of times greater numbers. Pol Pot did not fear the insurgents. After a couple of months in the rear, he headed to the front lines to join the most promising, in his opinion, faction. These were the revolutionaries from North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. Within a couple of months, Pol Pot was convinced that the Vietnamese were reliable and brought a few comrades from the Marxist circle back to the camp. Word by word, he soon found himself managing propaganda in the position of an assistant secretary. At about this time, King Sihanouk made another mistake, which at first glance did not seem like one. He negotiated with the French for the full independence of Cambodia, and then with North Vietnam to have them withdraw their insurgents from the country. After 90 years of colonial oppression, it was not the brave revolutionaries who liberated the country, but King Sihanouk. The Civil War, along with the First Indochina War, finally ended. So where was the mistake, you ask? It was that the king let the genie out of the bottle. You see, the insurgents that our hero joined were primarily a Vietnamese organization. When they fought all of Indochina against the French, Pol Pot was just a cog in their military system. But as soon as they left Cambodia, Pol Pot and his friends found their hands untied. By that time, he had already become adept in propaganda and guerrilla warfare, founded a socialist party as a cover, and began preparing for a revolution with his allies. The machinery of political struggle had already been set into motion and could not be stopped. Yet before the elections of the year 1955, Pol Pot held a sliver of hope that power could be seized peacefully. Then the king founded his own party and fabricated its victory in the elections. At this point, Pol Pot could no longer contain himself. He completely withdrew from major public politics and went underground. During the day, he worked as a school teacher, astonishing students with quotes from Rousseau and Voltaire. The Parisian gestalt haunted the man. In the evenings, he no longer held lectures but seminars for his communist comrades. By the end of the 1950s, the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, that is Cambodia, was formed. To put it plainly, the country is called Kampuchea by the locals. Cambodia is for foreigners. And so it went. But joining Pol Pot's party was not easy for an ordinary person. The communists were so obsessed with secrecy that even the central governing body, the Committee of General Affairs, was kept secret from ordinary comrades. Pol Pot became the third person in the committee, and thus in the party. And 2 years later, the king played into Pol Pot's hands. He ordered the arrest of the party's general secretary, who was tortured to death. His deputy, to avoid trouble, left the party. Voila! Through the hands of others, Pol Pot became the head of all the communists in Cambodia. But the king could not be stopped. He declared himself the lifelong head of Cambodia, suppressed mass protests, and then invited the most prominent socialists, including Pol Pot, to negotiate and govern the country together. Guys, I just killed, imprisoned, and tortured your close friends and supporters. Are there any volunteers willing to work in our friendly team? Just in case, this is sarcasm. It is unknown whether any left-wing politicians responded to this call, but Pol Pot decided that it was enough for him and retreated into the jungle. In the jungles at the border of eastern Cambodia and southern Vietnam was the office of the Organizations Center. This is what Pol Pot called his first operations headquarters. Headquarters is a rather bold name for a cluster of huts, a couple of bunkers, and a system of tunnels akin to the Viet Cong. But at least it served its main function. The living conditions in the office were terrible. Due to the dense tree canopies, the sun was invisible. The camp's 30 inhabitants had an allowance of 20 kilograms of rice per month. This amounted to a little more than 20 grams per person per day. Therefore, the guerrillas took on roles as hunter-gatherers, eating whatever they could find, from moths to dogs and even elephants, and still they starved. One of the first communist settlers recounted, "I will forever remember one chicken feast where we shared a single bird among us all. I think I've never eaten anything more delicious." As a bonus, to hunger came isolation. The insurgents could not leave the confines of the base, as doing so could expose their location. It was in such conditions in the jungle office that Pol Pot's elaborate ideology was prepared. Now, a bit of theory, but believe me, it's wrapped with so much action that it rivals any thriller. First, a caveat. As we've reiterated, we're people reasoning within the paradigm of Western thought. It so happened that most ideologies, including communism, are Western inventions. Thus, in the East, these Western models don't function quite as they do in Europe. Communism in the German Democratic Republic and Poland was much closer to the Soviet Union than the communism of Mao Zedong. In Cambodia, the situation was even more convoluted. There, the communists did not merely fill Marxist teachings with their national nuances. They decided to completely depart from Western tenets to construct their unique version of communism. And here's what most influenced their ideas. First of all, Khrushchev. He, it seems, wanted to make the planet socialist through peaceful means. Therefore, he was a revisionist and an enemy of the people. Every Cambodian knew that socialism could only be built through permanent revolution. This position brought Pol Pot and his comrades closer to China, which at that time also had strained relations with the Soviet Union. The second component in the ideological cauldron was precisely the Chinese specificity. Pol Pot traveled to the Big Brother in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, meeting with Deng Xiaoping and other big figures who taught him about the dictatorship of the proletariat, class struggle, and political purges. Pol Pot returned with a full understanding that Marxism needed to be adapted in his own Cambodian way, and that for the sake of revolution, one could completely reshape not only the country's economy and politics, but also the very foundations of the citizens' lives. His motto was always, "It's better to go too far than not far enough." As a national reference point, the communists chose Angkor, known as Cambodia's Golden Age. Perhaps you've seen in photos or in person Angkor Wat, the beautiful temple and symbol of Cambodia. It was being built precisely during the heyday of the Angkor Empire, which is to Cambodia what modern Egypt is to ancient Egypt. Pol Pot was not concerned with such nuances. Thus, they devised the idea that Angkor was some kind of paradise on earth, where everyone was equal, growing rice side by side, herding cows, and avoiding human vices like greed and lust for power. In his youth, even while in Paris, Pol Pot spoke well of Buddhism as a democratic force, but now he stood firmly against it. Not because religion is the opiate of the people, but because Buddhism promised justice only later, someday, after 100,000 reincarnations. Pol Pot needed justice here and now, and he knew such slogans would find an audience. Here, we begin to tread into terrifying territory. The next programmatic point of the Cambodian communists was to make everyone Cambodians. In the language of the revolutionaries, this meant Khmers. Later, he announced that the working class must be destroyed as a decadent relic of the past. It would be interesting to know what Marx would have said had he heard this cover version of his ideological model. Meanwhile, Pol Pot reorganized the Cambodian Labour Party into the Communist Party and began decisive preparations for war with King Sihanouk. The term Khmer Rouge, by the way, was first used by the king at that time. In January of the year 1968, the Khmers made their first move. They attacked an army post in western Cambodia, then other parts and police stations. This was the first stage of the revolutionary plan to seize weapons, and here the king erred as never before. In fact, twice. Firstly, he ordered the areas where insurgents operated to be obliterated. It doesn't take a genius to realize that peaceful residents would not appreciate this, and that's exactly what happened. 100,000 peasants immediately joined the Khmers. Then the king went to beg for help from the states. "Support my regime and I'll turn a blind eye if you happen to defend the Vietnamese communists here." But at the mention of Vietnamese communists, the eyes of American generals glazed over. They organized not one but two operations for massive bombings of Cambodia. The country was bombed with 3 times more ordnance than Japan during World War II, excluding the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it was personally green-lighted by the king. The result of these atrocities was the events I briefly mentioned in the first chapter. 150,000 killed, hundreds of thousands of refugees, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of volunteers joining Pol Pot's army. What did the king receive in exchange for all this? A coup d'etat, and from his recent situational allies no less. While the king was vacationing on the French Riviera, a puppet was installed at the head of Cambodia by the United States. It was a very strange maneuver. As you recall, the Khmer Rouge were fighting not personally against King Sihanouk, but simply for power in the country. And since now the enemies of the king were in power, by the logic of an enemy of my enemy, Sihanouk became their ally. So thought the king. In exile, he established a new government and began supporting communists, including Pol Pot, to unite against the United States. It was like a soap opera, only bloodier. Back in 1970, Saloth Sar, from a very influential family, adopted the widely recognized name Pol. It wasn't a trivial matter, but a whole ritual. The Khmer typically chose a spiritual name when becoming monks, and the Khmer Rouge took a revolutionary name. When you changed your name, it meant you were renouncing your past life and transitioning to a new quality. Before us was no longer Saloth Sar, a communist theoretician and guerrilla, but Pol, a revolutionary and contender for power in the country. In the year 1971, Pol Pot toured his territories for the first time. The military mainly commanded there, building communism according to protocol. In the liberated lands, there was no corruption, gambling was prohibited, as well as alcohol and any relationships outside of marriage. Each community had its local governing body. It was almost like the communist utopia Pol Pot aspired to. This is how it ideally appeared. Cambodia was to become a network of cooperatives, simplified collective farms where inhabitants would mimic the lifestyle of the poorest peasantry. What was utopian about this? The idea that if everyone were peasants, everyone would be equal and thus oppression would disappear. If we live modestly, we don't need many resources, right? We need to live in peace and harmony, grow food, produce as much agricultural machinery as possible, and obey the supreme leader. Initially, this was the direction things were heading. There were, of course, exceptions. Land had to be taken from wealthy peasants to be given to the poor. The former didn't like this, but the latter certainly did. All Cambodians were forced to wear the same clothing: black suits, red and white scarves, and sandals made from cut-up car tires. Here the aim was to mimic the life of the poorest segments of Cambodian society. The red and white scarves, in hindsight, were probably unnecessary. Incidentally, Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, dressed exactly the same. In 1972, as the army grew, the Vietnamese communists began to leave Cambodia. They were more needed at home, pushing back the states there. For Pol Pot, this provided even more resources to manage the course of the revolution single-handedly. The following year, he decided to attack the capital, Phnom Penh. It was to repel this attack that the bombers, seen by our protagonist at the beginning of our video, were sent, and the shelling he had to endure was from the Khmer side. US support for the official authorities gradually weakened and the ammunition ran out. At a certain point, the head of the government ordered a circle of sacred sand to be drawn around the besieged Phnom Penh for protection. On the 17th of April, 1975, the communists took Phnom Penh, and 3 days later, their leader entered the city. Another civil war was over, but for Pol Pot, having control over territory wasn't enough. He had a new goal: to subjugate the will of the entire nation. Chapter 5. Year Zero. The majority of the residents of Phnom Penh were evacuated within 72 hours. All 2.5 million people were moved out of the city over the course of several months. The city was completely deserted. Among those who left was the family of the student Siang Seng, consisting of 24 people. As you recall, 23 of them would not survive under Pol Pot's regime. Seng recalled, "You have probably heard in the news that the Khmer Rouge tortured and killed people by striking them on the head with a hoe or throwing children against a tree to save bullets. But I believe that most people in those years died of starvation." During the march out of the Cambodian capital alone, as many as 20,000 people could have died. The evacuation took place in April, the hottest month, when daytime temperatures could exceed 35 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity. In essence, this was little different from the Cherokee Trail of Tears or the Nazi death marches. But the true horror lay ahead. The unsuspecting people were met with the so-called killing fields, agricultural lands where all city dwellers were taken. Seng and his family were given a hoe each and instructed to till the land. There was no machinery in the village anymore, nor were there any livestock. All cows and horses were slaughtered by locals when the Khmer Rouge declared collectivization 2 years prior. A typical workday lasted from 16 to 18 hours, from early morning until late evening. The work week was 10 days long with 1 day off. This schedule was borrowed by Pol Pot from the French revolutionaries. The ration was 2 cans of rice per day for 10 people. And anything that could be found, from leaves to rats and snakes, was consumed. People had to live in huts that they were required to build themselves. Until they were built, they slept in hammocks. Let me remind you that in Cambodia, the rainy season lasts half a year. Most frustratingly, at any moment you could be relocated to another village and have to start building anew. It is important to clarify one crucial point here. People were not taken to the fields specifically to be killed there. This was not an industrial death factory like the Nazi Auschwitz. The killing fields were named so retrospectively, and the author of the term was the very Cambodian journalist from the film of the same name. His story is real. He managed to escape from these fields. His less fortunate compatriots died there by the hundreds of thousands from starvation and diseases. Naturally, no one was treated. None of Seng's 23 relatives, for example, were killed because they held any incorrect political views. Although such executions did occur, people were usually killed for suspicions of conspiracy, concealing important facts about themselves, embezzlement of public property, and other fictitious reasons. As a rule, people were simply beaten to death. For some time, student Seng worked as a corpse carrier, hauling a dozen bodies at a time in a cart to the graves. Approximately 20,000 such mass graves have been preserved in Cambodia. Not everyone was buried. Some victims' bones were ground into dust for fertilizer. There are currently fewer than 15,000 villages in Cambodia. This means that even if we assume there were more in the mid-1970s, it still works out to each village having its own killing field, a catastrophic scale. How was this monstrous machine managed at all? In short, poorly and ineffectively. Pol Pot stayed in the capital while his deputies were in the regional centres, but all the action took place in the villages where the local authorities were in control. There was no centralisation. Initially, it wasn't needed. The interests of ordinary Khmers coincided with those of their leader. They could loot and kill without orders from above. Later, autonomy and the breakdown of communication would become a problem, but we will discuss that later. At first, the everyday life of Cambodians resembled that of African American slaves in the United States in the 19th century, but then things got even worse. Pol Pot declared the Year Zero policy. This was also a borrowing from the First French Republic, where a new calendar was introduced after the monarchy was overthrown. The revolution had been accomplished, and they began a new era. In Cambodia, the revolution was in process, and so the year was not the first, but the zeroth. The revolutionary decided that to build utopia, the old society had to be completely destroyed. The odometer of history wound back to zero, and then a paradise on earth built on the ruins. What is the essence of Year Zero? Pol Pot divided society into 3 layers and turned the social pyramid upside down. At the top, according to Pol Pot, were the full-fledged members of society, poor or at least not wealthy peasants, who had been peasants even before the Khmer Rouge came to power. They could hold local government positions and join the Communist Party. In the middle were the candidates, meaning middle-class farmers, urban resettlers, and simply more or less educated people such as our hero, the student Seng. They needed to be re-educated to, so to speak, knock the nonsense out of their heads. The easiest way to identify such people was by their glasses. Too smart, are you? Do you read books, bespectacled one? Hence, the Khmers would immediately confiscate glasses and burn books. At the bottom were the undesirable elements. This group included well-off people as well as those who had worked for past authorities, said anything against the communists, or were too educated. God forbid you revealed that you knew English or French, you'd immediately fall into this category. No re-education could help here. Cambodia needed to be cleansed of such elements. On the ground, the situation looked different. The last 2 groups merged into one: outsiders. Because only full-fledged Cambodians, meaning poor rural residents, could decide how to treat whom. The entire system of local self-governance consisted of such poor peasants. Pol Pot's Cambodia was like a large-scale Stanford prison experiment, but outdoors. And the stakes were much higher. Pol Pot deliberately chose people from the lowest social strata as wardens. He gave them power they had never had before. They already disliked the much wealthier and more successful city dwellers. But now they had carte blanche for violence. He who was nobody became everyone, and even more. Naturally, excesses at the local level immediately began, if one could call the indiscriminate mass killings an excess. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of undeserved, unjust deaths. Let me remind you, Those ruling the villages were the same people who, during the Civil War, would slaughter and consume the liver of those they deemed spies. It is especially important to note, to the Khmer Rouge, those working the land, the ideology of Pol Pot, and whatever he concocted in his head was of no interest. Unfortunately, those people would not have understood these principles, no matter how much they tried. Their leaders had elite university educations, philosophical foundations, and royal concubines. Those whom he entrusted with local power despised the educated urban dwellers. It turns out that such terrible events were partly due to a lack of education. Remember this moment? How did the world react to the horrors in Kampuchea? Both the United States and the USSR, the two main players on the global stage in the 1970s, more or less understood what was happening in the country. Soviet documentarians even made a film about the genocide titled Kampuchea, the people who wanted to be killed in the year 1979. It is available on YouTube, but I must warn you, this movie is not for the faint of heart. From the title, it is obvious that the Union regarded the Pol Pot regime very negatively. Wait a moment, aren't communists supposed to be comrades? Well, no. Not all communists are the same. In Kampuchea, they were too radical for Brezhnev's USSR. Besides, they were distancing themselves from Vietnam, which the Soviets supported. And the country's friendship with China did not please Moscow either. However, the United States welcomed Pol Pot since he was against the USSR, in a manner of speaking. Journalists reported on all these atrocities, and officials had to express deep concern. For instance, President Carter referred to the Khmer Rouge as the worst human rights violators. But there were no significant sanctions or military intervention. America had barely managed to extricate itself from Vietnam, and it certainly couldn't afford another such war. Let's record this important moment. Pol Pot did not step onto the square and announce this over a loudspeaker. He was not Hitler or Félicien Kabuga, one of the masterminds of the genocide in Rwanda. But Pol Pot created all the conditions to make mass murder as easy as possible. The leader of the Khmer Rouge was not particularly worried about the fact that hundreds of thousands would die because of him, because it's better to venture too far. In the year 1976, his dreadful future arrived. A famine began. If the year before food was only scarce and issued in quotas, now there was none at all, largely because the slave cooperatives, without access to technology and fertilizers, apart from bone meal, were extremely ineffective. The military on the ground lied to the party leadership, saying they had no problems. The exact same story as with Mao's officials who could not be cross-checked, and the country's leader understood this. But even after Pol Pot himself learned about the famine, he did nothing to address it. The dictator had a more pressing task: to cement his power. In that same year of 1976, while thousands of people resorted to cannibalism, he renamed Cambodia to Democratic Kampuchea. He declared that the national revolution was transitioning into a socialist one. He removed the formal head of state, who was still considered to be King Sihanouk, placing him under house arrest. Now the entire country was solely in Pol Pot's hands. Importantly, before this, no one had heard of Pol Pot or had any idea about the person who arrived in the capital, settled in the Silver Pagoda, the royal temple, and started issuing orders left and right. It sounds absurd. We're used to dictators hanging their portraits everywhere and embracing a cult of personality. With Pol Pot, the story was quite the opposite. Remember, I mentioned that his comrades from the Marxist circle called him secretive? Well, consider this. All these years he managed party affairs and military actions from the shadows while sending another person to meetings and public appearances. This dictator rejected the cult of personality. There were no songs written about him, nor plays staged about his exploits. In everyday affairs, the lifestyle of the Kampuchea dictator was also quite modest. No luxury cars like Hitler, no buried stacks of cash like Pablo Escobar. He wasn't even recorded as owning a pair of boots or a pipe. Yet he lived in the pagoda and carried on. This temple, in terms of comfort, could hardly be called a penthouse. Indeed, it was a non-residential premise, but it was conveniently located in the very center of the capital. Modesty was one of Pol Pot's few positive qualities, frankly speaking, but it didn't prevent him from committing such atrocities that would have made even Mao's wise head's hair stand on end. Interestingly, In 1975, the Chinese leader spoke of Pol Pot with respect. The Khmer Rouge have a lot of experience. He is even better than us. We have no right to criticize you. Yet Mao tried to reason with his colleague. Firstly, don't blindly imitate China's path to communism. Secondly, for heaven's sake, abandon your insane methods. They helped seize power in the country, no one disputes that, but you cannot rule with them. He emptied cities, divided the entire country's population into 3 castes. He placed the least educated at the top and gave them a carte blanche to destroy all others. Enemies of the regime, even potential ones, stood no chance of surviving, let alone collaborating. However, an apparatus for state governance cannot be built from such a meat grinder. It will continue grinding people. But a year later, the great Chinese helmsman died, leaving no one to restrain Pol Pot. Chapter 6. The Genocide Machine. Pol Pot was always a control freak. What was his speech in Paris in the early 1950s about? I will run the party myself, maintain dossiers, instruct ministers, etc., etc. Prophetic words. Even when he became a dictator, micromanagement continued. He personally composed the menu for state receptions. He devised radio broadcast schedules. Only trusted friends were allowed to the country's governance, while he kept others at a distance. When King Sihanouk met with him to discuss the state of the civil war, he did not know with whom he was speaking. The identity of Pol Pot was kept in the strictest secrecy from everyone except the party's central committee. This committee consisted of 9 people, including Pol Pot himself. Therefore, this dictator changed names like gloves. For simplicity, I first called him Saloth Sar and later Pol Pot. In reality, over more than 30 years, he managed to change about a dozen pseudonyms. Pol Pot believed this: the more often you change your name, the better. It confuses the enemies. A genius of conspiracy from the Boulevard Montparnasse. His actions made it clear that he did not trust anyone, not only his enemies, but also his friends. Even in field camps, which, by the way, were located in remote jungles kilometers from the front line, he had a tent in a separate fenced territory with security. Paranoia was his downfall. Here's how it happened. Earlier I mentioned that the Khmer Rouge began to estrange themselves from Vietnam. The reason is simple. Back in the 1960s, Pol Pot visited this country and allegedly discovered plans for building an Indo-Chinese federation. Cambodia was supposed to be part of this federation. Most likely it was not a solid plan, but merely one of the scenarios. Such contingencies exist for most countries. But Pol Pot could not shake off an uneasy premonition. His power was absolute. That would become impossible here. Of course, that did not prevent him from accepting Vietnamese assistance when possible. But once he completely seized power in Cambodia, and the Vietnamese communists expelled the United States and unified the country under their control, the situation changed. Vietnam was bigger and stronger, directly aided by the Soviet Union. Pol Pot was not particularly confident in China. The United States, moreover, supported his regime only verbally. Of course, there was no 100% guarantee that Vietnam was preparing an attack on Cambodia. But what if they were? And what if their agents were already among the Khmer Rouge and planning a coup? Within a few years, the Vietnamese turned from close allies into Cambodia's main enemies. Oceania has always been at war with Eastasia. Until now, we have talked about that part of the genocide that Pol Pot led with his brilliant politics. But now, more people were dying directly at his hands. Any unreliable personnel, not only high-ranking officials, but also ordinary Khmer Rouge members, were sent to a prison called S21, a former secondary school, now a genocide museum. At the end of the 1970s, it was Pol Pot's main stage. Life there was not sweet and very short. Heaven forbid you ended up in S21. The first thing they would do was photograph you and demand a detailed biography. Then you'd be taken to a tiny cell of 6 square meters where a dozen unfortunate souls were already crammed. Shackles would be placed on your feet. You would sleep in them too. The menu included 4 teaspoons of rice and leaf soup twice a day. In this regard, the prison was even worse than the killing fields. At least there were rats there, but here only lice. You couldn't even scratch yourself without permission. Shackles were removed only if you were going for interrogation. And here, Believe me, it would have been better if you had remained in the dirty and cramped cell. Because interrogation always has two possible outcomes. Either you confess to everything and you are simply beaten, or you remain silent like a fish, and they torture you until you confess anyway. The entire prison infirmary worked to ensure that the wounded prisoners did not die before repenting for their crimes. The tortures varied greatly: electric shocks, red-hot metal, nail extraction followed by alcohol treatment. Some were simply strangled or cut with a knife. Strictly speaking, killing outright was undesirable. The worst was yet to come. Namely, after you confessed to everything. You would face execution anyway. The only question was how. If lucky, you would be beaten to death with improvised objects and buried near the prison building. Truth be told, after a year there was no more space left there. Therefore, prisoners were transferred to a separate extermination center. They did the exact same thing there. Sometimes the executioners were teenagers, and if you were unlucky, you ended up in the very infirmary. For experiments akin to Unit 731 of Japan. The experiments were conducted without anesthesia. Local medics tried to understand, for example, whether a person would die if all their organs were removed. A total of 20,000 political prisoners and their relatives passed through S21 prison. Do you know how many walked out alive? 12. Not thousands, just 12 people. The Cambodian authorities cite a figure of nearly 200 survivors. But we do not know all their names. Moreover, at least 60 of them were released, but then ended up back in prison and died there. The purges within the party did not end there. Here we return to the ideology of Pol Pot, and remember that in addition to urban residents, he did not favor Buddhists. He also wanted to create ethnic leveling. Of course, this did not end well. Ordinary Buddhists could hide their faith, but Buddhist monks were classified by the Khmer as a special class, social parasites. Monks were sent to public works, including death camps. We do not know exactly how many monks perished at the hands of the Khmer Rouge, but out of almost 3,000 clergy, only 70 survived Pol Pot's regime. Internal documents of the Communist Party speak of the destruction of 95% of local monks. This accounts for roughly 65,000 victims. Furthermore, discrimination based on nationality. Officially, there was none. On paper, everyone was a Kampuchean, that is, a resident of Kampuchea. In practice, this meant complete supremacy of ethnic Khmers. In the mid-1970s, they made up 85% of the country's population. The rest were minorities. The communists, on one hand, ignored them. They said Khmers made up 99% of the country, and the rest were statistical errors. On the other hand, this did not prevent them from systematically destroying their communities. The Chinese, for instance, were entirely city dwellers. They were discriminated against precisely for this, not for their ethnicity. But if the share of Khmer urban victims during the 4 years of genocide was 25%, then among the Chinese, every second person perished. The Cham people, who were Muslims, were prohibited from practicing their religion, and local communities were dispersed to various corners of the country. Most community leaders were executed. The overall death toll amounted to 36% of the Cham population. The Vietnamese fared the worst because Vietnam was considered an enemy by Pol Pot, and its people were seen as potential enemy agents. By the year 1975, only 200,000 Vietnamese remained in Cambodia out of almost 500,000. These were the ones who did not manage to leave. Approximately 100,000 were simply expelled from the country by the dictator, while the rest were annihilated. Pol Pot did not shy away from killing his own. Towards the end of his rule, his paranoia peaked, and he began purging the eastern borders of the country near Vietnam. Even the most loyal Khmers were targeted just because they could theoretically have connections with the enemies. The eastern populace was forcefully driven to the west. Since they were visually indistinguishable from other compatriots, they were marked with blue scarves. The proper Khmers, I remind you, were adorned in red and white colours. In the process, up to 100,000 improper Khmers perished. This did not happen over 4 years, but approximately within 6 bloody months. It turns out that directly by the hands of Pol Pot, about 600,000 people perished for political, religious and ethnic reasons. But before the nightmare could finally end, Even more innocent people had to die. Chapter 7. Back to the roots. While Cambodia was starving and its residents were killing each other, Pol Pot decided it was necessary to wage war on Vietnam. Vietnamese troops had left the country just a year earlier. One would think that it was time to live peacefully with one another. But the dictator of Kampuchea was unsettled by plans from Hanoi. Pol Pot then ordered the Khmer Rouge to attack the border areas of Vietnam. Under artillery cover, soldiers cleared several villages, killing hundreds of civilians. There were other raids in which mainly simple peasants died. Vietnam retaliated with fire and then sent 50,000 soldiers across the border. By that time, the Cambodian army barely exceeded 90,000. A year remained before active hostilities began. The Vietnamese were simply pulling their forces together, but a short incursion by saboteurs was enough to cause Cambodian officers to panic and oppose the authorities. At that time, Pol Pot launched the most brutal phase of his genocide against his people, and Vietnam began a full-scale offensive. The Khmer Rouge tried to resist, but 150,000 Vietnamese soldiers moved through Cambodia like a knife through butter. In just 2 weeks, they captured the capital, Phnom Penh, and installed their government there. Vietnam lost tens of thousands of soldiers. The Khmer Rouge, 15. That marked the end of the history of democratic Kampuchea, but not Pol Pot. He returned to the jungle and engaged in what he did best, guerrilla warfare. He had 3 factors on his side. Firstly, he retained formal legitimacy, meaning that most other countries recognized his government as the legitimate authority in Cambodia. For this, Pol Pot had to secure the support of the king without a crown, Mr. Sihanouk. Ultimately, the United Nations General Assembly, believe it or not, voted to support the old cannibalistic government of the country rather than the new Vietnamese one. Secondly, Pol Pot received military assistance from China and the United States. Both countries condemned the genocide, but did not want Vietnam to gain more territory and influence in the region, because when we say Vietnam, we imply the Soviet Union. Finally, the third point. The Cambodians, despite everything, remained nationalists and did not want to lose their independence. Therefore, they were willing to serve Pol Pot. Even though he was an odious character, he was still considered one of their own. Pol Pot, meanwhile, had to compromise his principles for the sake of victory. He disbanded the Communist Party, or rather, what was left after all the purges. He announced the creation of a national movement to unite the left and the right. He exchanged his black peasant attire for Thai camouflage and sought help from capitalists. Capitalists generally were eager to assist Pol Pot. The dictator himself didn't even notice how he became the vanguard of the anti-communist movement. Almost all Eastern Bloc countries supported Vietnam, while only China backed the Khmer Rouge. You heard it right. A convinced communist utopian became a nationalist who went against other communists and even greater nationalists. Vietnamese troops occupied all cities and main roads, but the countryside remained under Khmer control. When Pol Pot captured Phnom Penh in the year 1975, it was a total victory. For the Vietnamese, it marked the stage of a new, long and bloody war. Vietnam spent a third of its budget on it. Communist reforms in the south faltered, while the west tightened the economic blockade. Therefore, in the year 1982, this country began withdrawing troops from Cambodia. The final nail in the coffin was the perestroika in the Soviet Union, after which Vietnam had to cut subsidies. They needed the money themselves. From that moment on, Vietnam and Cambodia began negotiations. Pol Pot formally stepped down as commander, but in practice continued to make major decisions. Gradually, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, now over 60 years old, lost his revolutionary fervor and changed his tune. He said, "I am old and immobilized. I know that people in Cambodia fear me. If the Vietnamese withdraw and we can protect our country, I will retire. And when I die, I will die peacefully." In 1989, the parties signed the Paris Peace Agreements. Cambodia maintained its independence and territory. A year later, 22,000 UN peacekeepers arrived in the country to maintain order. Eventually, Cambodia became a constitutional monarchy again. Our main supporting actor, King Sihanouk, returned to his throne, which he first ascended in the year 1941. It turns out that Vietnam withdrew, the country survived, and everyone seemed to forget about the genocide. Pol Pot probably retired as he promised. He quite quickly violated the peace agreement. The Khmer Rouge refused to lay down their arms, terrorized Vietnamese villages before the elections, and resisted central authority as much as they could. By the mid-1990s, the forces of the dictator had been reduced to a tiny strip of territory, only several hundred kilometers long, with 4,000 soldiers at their disposal. At this moment, Pol Pot began to lose his sanity. Initially, he re-established the regimes in the villages under his control, similar to those of the 1970s, with identical clothing, communal farms, and similar practices. Then he suddenly lost trust in one of his closest associates and ordered him to be killed. The rest of Pol Pot's entourage realized that he was now not only tyrannical and brutal, but also insane, and promptly placed him under house arrest. Soon after, he faced a trial which announced the verdict: life imprisonment. Less than a year later, on April 15, 1998, Pol Pot was found dead in his bed. The official version cited a heart attack, but a journalist who had been in Pol Pot's chamber clarified that the former dictator had committed suicide using a lethal dose of medication. 3 days later, his widow cremated his body on a pile of car tires and rubbish, and then buried him according to Buddhist customs. In 1999, the last strongholds of Khmer Rouge resistance would be subdued.